last quick tip video, we were showing this Airbnb sentiment analysis that had sentiment calculated for the different reviews on the various listings of Airbnbs in the Seattle area. And we took a random sample on the review data set, and the way we did that is we created these transformations that were to calculate a new column, generate a random number, filter down to about 20% or some subset of those values by filtering down the random number and then excluding that column. And you'll notice here that this box for these transformations is separate from the loaded data box. And that's because all the data was brought into Spotfire and then the transformations were done. But we can actually do these transformations as the data is loaded to reduce the size of the dashboard. And this isn't just for things like random number. I could filter by, let's say, the neighborhood, if I only want specific neighborhoods or specific dates, I could filter it that way. I can also exclude columns to reduce the width of my data table and reduce the data that way, any columns I don't need. And I can even do data functions on this. And so we're going to talk about that today. So I'm actually going to start from scratch here to show you the step-by-step. I'm going to go to Browse Local File. I'm going to grab my reviews and my listings data sets. And I'm going to open this so I get a preview for listings, a preview for reviews. I'll hit OK. And then I can actually select these data tables. And when I do, I get this option to transform data. So what I'll do is I will exclude some columns first. And there's a lot of extra information about notes and transit, stuff with the host ID. I don't need a lot of this information, so I'll just take these columns out and I'll hit OK. And then I can also filter rows. So let's say I want to just look at one neighborhood. I can add a transformation here. So let's say neighborhood, and we'll just do for the Ballard neighborhood. All right, so I've entered that in. And I'll close this, and you'll see that the transformations were added right there, and I can always add or edit these if I need to. And with reviews, we did a random sample, so I'm just going to do that real quick. All right, I just went ahead and added each of those transformations, and I'm going to hit close here. Again, you can see those right there. Now, I can add this as a new data table, and that's going to bring into separate data tables in Spotfire. I'll have separate windows in the data canvas, or I can just go ahead and join these right now, and it's just going to create one data table, one final data table in Spotfire, one data table in my interface. So for my matched columns, I'm going to match these by the listing ID, and I'm just going to choose an inner join. And I'll hit OK, and I will hit OK there. So now all those transformations are being performed, and I can go to my data canvas. And here you'll now see for these transformations, when I click on one of these data nodes, you'll see it's within this box, and that's for both of these. So it's within that box. So if I click these little three dots, I get an option where I can edit these transformations or remove these transformations. But I should point out that in order to do these transformations on load, Spotfire needs access to the data source, and it has to be brought in memory. So you can do this when you're bringing in flat files, and you can do this when you're doing information links, but if you're doing data connections, you should use the on-demand settings or writing the queries as you want in the database queries. And that way you can actually push the transformations to the database itself and not have to use the Spotfire memory. It's not being brought into the Spotfire memory. But for using the in-memory data, the data that's transferred over the wire into the Spotfire application, we can do this data on these transformations on load. And to point out, again, it needs access to the data source. So if I do store data here, you'll see that the option to edit those transformations or remove them go away. But if I use either the new data when possible or the always new data, then I'll be able to, again, change these. So just keep that in mind when you're doing the transformations on load. Another useful transformation to do on load is to do a data function. And why would you want to do a data function on load? Well, there's a couple reasons. Let's say you're using R or Python to do data prep, and you're doing that outside of Spotfire, and you're doing that on your raw data, you get your data just how you like it, and then you want to move things into Spotfire. Well, you don't want to do those wrangling steps one by one into the Spotfire interface all over again. I mean, you could do it that way, but it'd be much easier just to take your code, copy and paste it, make it into a data function, and then Spotfire is going to run that code, that data prep code, and it's going to spit out the prep data, the output data for you into one of these source nodes. Now, the other reason is if you're using R, Python, MATLAB, any one of these languages, and you're doing some advanced calculations, some modeling, and even if your output is completely different structure and format than your input, well, you can use a data function to do those calculations, and just the results can then come into your analysis. And the way you do this is you go into your transformations and you go down to data functions, and you would just insert it. And this is going to bring up the data functions in the library. If you're doing this method, you have to have the data function saved in the library, because Spotfire is actually running all this before it opens up the application, before it loads up the full application. And that way it can access the data function from the library and run all that. It also requires that your input and output parameters are data tables. So just keep that in mind. Now, I think this is a little known feature in Spotfire.